Hello, and thank you for tuning in and listening to the MEMO conversation with me, Nassim Ahmed. Today, I have an amazing guest. Many of you will know him. He is an investigative journalist, author, Matt Kennard. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So Matt is an author, as I said, and a journalist. He was previously the head of investigations at the website Declassified UK. Which he co-founded with author and historian Mark Curtis. He is also an author of a number of books. One of the earlier one is The Racket, which is an investigation or investigative expose of the US empire and its global systems of control. And the latest book, which he published, co-authored last year, is Silent Coup, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy, Multinational Corporations and Financial Institutions. I should also add that Matt has worked previously and written for The New Statesman, The Guardian, The Financial Times, The Intercept, and Novara Media as well. But if we can kickstart, Matt, I've invited Matt really to discuss Western complicity in the Gaza genocide and to understand just how deep this complicity runs. And I will also be asking Matt about his views on the collapse in the mainstream media and what that means for, the work Matt does and others do, the alternative media sources. But if I can pick up on your two books, Matt, The Racket and The Silent Coup, um, are there same phenomena at play in Israel's occupation of Palestine and in the Gaza genocide itself, besides some of the obvious factors that are at play, like, for example, settler colonial ideology of Zionism, the West's ironclad support for Israel, Christian Zionism. What are the other more, I should say, more hidden forces at play that are at the root of what animating the Gaza genocide, or at the root of the Gaza genocide?
Well, firstly, there's specific chapters on Palestine in both of those books. So Silent Coup, which we brought out last year, was about how basically at the end of the Second World War, when decolonization happened, and there were a lot of independence movements were victorious. You know, in India, all throughout Africa in the 60s, they threw off the imperial powers in a formal sense. But what happened was that basically colonialism was repackaged, and it was repackaged as development, and it was done through specific institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. But the thesis of the book is that after the end of the Cold War, there wasn't another poll that was a check on rampant resurgent capitalism, which was obviously backed up by the US and basically enforced by the US. And it went completely mad, this system that was created after the Second World War. The chapter on Palestine is about how the occupation. Well, I went there in 2016 to report. I wasn't allowed into Gaza, even though I wanted to go. Obviously it's a prison, so you have to apply for a visa from the Israeli government, which didn't give it to me. I went to Palestine as well in 2009, and again went to the West Bank and applied for a visa to go to Gaza, and they wouldn't allow me in then either. But the part about Palestine is quite illustrative of this whole trend, because the chapters about how Israel has privatized the occupation of the West Bank. So we went and talked to Palestinian human rights workers who document human rights abuses in the West Bank, and they were saying that more and more it was private military forces subcontracted by the Israeli regime that were carrying out atrocities, that were manning checkpoints. So there's one called Ezrachi, which is now runs many of the checkpoints. So Kalandia checkpoint's a major checkpoint which Palestinians have to go through to get into Israel. And it's a monstrosity, you know. It's like when you go there, we went there at sort of 5 or 6 in the morning, because that's when the Palestinians who work in Israel have to go. They have to go that early because the process is so long. And they're basically in these little concrete pens going into Israel. It's apartheid, obviously, but it looks like some kind of prison camp. And then all the guards at Kalandia checkpoint are private military, and this goes to it's indicative of a trend around the world. The privatization of the use of force, and what that does is it gives the Israeli regime and other regimes around the world the chance to get out of accountability, because there's no accountability really for the Israeli occupation forces when they carry out the atrocities which they do sort of on a daily basis. But there's even less accountability for private forces because there's no mechanisms in place, and that's why they're favored by these human rights abusing regimes. It's also why it also goes to the point that profit making has become the major guiding force, and state power, which previously was a check on it, has diminished. And not only diminished in a formal sense of like corporations are more powerful than states now in a lot of cases, it's also that even state decisions themselves are being made on the basis of the interests of corporations, because corporations have infiltrated the governance system globally, but also domestically in all these countries. So and then obviously in the case of Gaza, you look at there's been quite a lot of work done about the gas reserves off the coast of Gaza, and this is something that isn't talked about enough. But the Israeli settler colonial regime is all about taking resources from the Palestinians, and partly why they withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and expanded settlements in West Bank is because Gaza is a sort of, apart from the gas reserve, doesn't have the resources of the West Bank. It's kind of a bit of a backwater for the Israelis. They were like, we'll just keep Gaza on life support and then take all the resources in the West Bank. So water, all the agricultural resources and all the rest of it. So it's emblematic of that. And then the racket is about US power. And I went to Palestine and in 2009, actually with the International Solidarity Movement, but I was there as a journalist as well. But you saw apartheid up close, and you saw what the United States is supporting, and not only supporting, but making happen, essentially, because if the US withdrew support from Israel, it would fold or have to abide by international law very, very quickly. So they are complicit and participants in the occupation of Palestine. And that really was in one way was completely an eye-opener, because and it goes to what you were talking about the media as well, because we're fed in the West lies about a lot of things, but the Israel-Palestine conflict is maybe the most corrupted discourse in the mainstream media. And when you go to Palestine, all that evaporates within hours of getting into the occupied territories, because you see up close what we are supporting, which is apartheid, division based on ethnic, religious lines, constant violence against the Palestinian population. And that was a real revelation to me in terms of the disconnect between what we're fed in the West and what about American power and its benign or even benevolent intentions, and the reality of it, which is they don't care about human life. They don't care about principles like freedom and democracy and human rights, because they've spent 76 years supporting a brutal occupation, and since 1967, even an officially illegal occupation. So Palestine is emblematic of the whole global system. In terms of in terms of the Gaza genocide now, I think that these realizations that I had back then have been happening on a much, much wider level, because, as I say, one of the main, maybe the biggest myth in the world, which is there's billions of dollars of resources put into maintaining this myth, is that America is this. It's not even an empire. You can't even say that. I mean, we have to say it's a superpower.
We're going to get into some of that later on.
Okay,
So, if I want to stick to the original, if I can ask another question related to the original point, and you mentioned that there is a privatization of the exploitation of people in Latin America, in Africa. I was reading a book a while back about how a lot of the institutions, oppressive institutions, and the exploitative institutions that are directed against people in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Latin America, there is a boomerang effect, meaning they are there will be a time when it will be directed against the populations in the West. So a lot of people may think, okay, what's happening in Israel, Palestine, in Gaza is going to stay in Israel, Palestine, but really those machines or mechanisms of oppression and repression comes back to the West, and then is refined and directed against the local population. Do you think that that's happening now? There is I read a book again by Jeff Helper, whose book War Against the People, that the whole world is somehow being Palestinized, and Israel's mechanism of control and domination and the technology of that is being recruited by governments in the West, democracies as well, to crack down on their own population. So that seems to be happening more and more, don't you think?
Yeah, 100%. And there's quite a lot of literature that's come out in recent years on this, in that, and that's also why Israel is supported by the far right around the world, because you have the far right narrative is that you have these westernized settlers that are disciplining the backward Muslim savages. And this is like the laboratory that they use to test out mechanisms of how can we pacify an indigenous population, which we've enslaved essentially and put in prisons. And the Israelis use it in their literature. I also looked into the sort of laboratory effects in the West Bank, and if you look into brochures from arms companies, Israeli ones like Elbit Systems and others, you see that they say after previous Gaza attacks on Gaza, they say that these weapons have been battle tested in Gaza, and they use that as a marketing technique. So and then obviously they say there's also the fact that the Israeli government is essentially the military is supported with $4 billion a year of military aid from the United States. And that in itself is an outrage, because American taxpayers are paying for these atrocities essentially. But what it is also is a system of corporate welfare, because what happens is that $4 billion is given to Israel, but on the condition that they buy weapons from US arms companies like Lockheed Martin and others. So the taxpayer gives this money, the US taxpayer gives this money to Israel, and it goes straight back to arms companies. So it's a system of public welfare of American corporations via this fascistic apartheid state. So it's a horrendous situation. But we saw this again and again, this boomerang effect you talked about with Silent Coup. Like it's very, very clear in the case of Israel, but even other mechanisms, like we looked into this shadow legal system where corporations can sue states, which was actually created in Germany after the Second World War, and was, as I said, like a mechanism through which they could control governments that were wanting to nationalize resources or enact policies in the interests of the people rather than foreign corporations. Now, that was all designed quite consciously as a way of controlling the developing world, but it has got out of control now, and Western states, Germany itself, got hit with a billions suit from a Swedish company for billions for enacting environmental policies that company didn't like. So there's no way that the West is immune from all these systems which they set up to subjugate and to enslave the global South. And we're seeing it more and more with what's happened in terms of the reaction to Gaza, because they've lost control of the narrative in the West in terms of, although the media's regurgitating lies and propaganda, the general population has come to an awakening of what's happening, largely because of social media. We can bypass the mainstream media in a way we couldn't before. But you look at the repression that's happening. If you look at the student encampments in the US, like amazingly out of proportion repression of the students. In the UK, we've had activists and journalists arrested under terrorism laws just for speaking out for Palestine. And that is all being done at the behest, essentially, of the Israeli regime. So that's a very, very tangible way whereby this violence and this repression and this repressive apparatus is coming back to the West. And a lot of our democratic freedoms are being dismantled to crack down on pro-Palestinian activism. It's absolutely wild that it's been allowed to happen. And also, one of the reasons it's been allowed to happen is because the media is not covering it. The 5 journalists and activists since the summer that have been detained, including Richard Medhurst, Sarah Wilkinson, Asa Winstanley, none of that has got into any mainstream newspaper I've looked since. So I think this is, as you say, this is all part of a trend whereby these strategies, which are trialed in the global south against subalterns that they think no one cares about, they never stay there. And this goes for every system we looked at. The other one is the special economic zones, which are these carved out pieces of territory which corporations push for governments around the world to create, because they're kind of like corporate paradises. You can apply different labor laws, or you can have different tax regimes, whatever it is. That they're coming back to the West. We got 13 free ports. Free ports are essentially special economic zones in the UK itself. So the point is, it's very, very hard to fight back against, because they are thinking in generational terms, these forces, about how they can maintain control, and we're not. And also, corporate and state powers mainly is the 2 major power centers in our society. The only real check on that is organized labor, and organized labor has been decimated by those very forces. A sort of alliance of state and corporate power have weakened organized labor massively in the Western world. Not so much in the global South. There's still some quite vibrant and strong trade union movements, but we're entering a phase where I think basically these strategies of oppression and subjugation are coming back home. And I think democracy will be unwinded, because the other thing is that obviously the context of this also is there's a new Cold War against China, which has been a recent phenomenon.
So on that, so if I can just redirect that question, this discussion. So you seem to be arguing that Israel's status position as an indispensable state to the authoritarian, indispensable to not just authoritarian governments, but also to democracies in the future, is really the main driving factor behind ironclad support. Historically, Israel was seen as the creation of the Zionist state, it initially was seen as a rampart of Western civilization. Then Israel was seen as a bulwark against communism. Then a check on, you would say, Arab nationalism. So you can see Israel's status in the imagination of the West has evolved over time, continuously evolved. So now, would you say its position as a centrality as an indispensable nation to authoritarianism is what's driving the ironclad support, in addition to the other things?
Yeah, I think it's part of it, because the military alliance between the UK, US, and Israel particularly is very, very strong, and a lot of the technologies are being developed in joint ways. But actually, I don't think that's the main driving force. I think that, as you say, the situation has evolved. I think initially it was a little settler colony where they could dominate the Middle East. And of course, ever since oil was found in the Middle East, Western policy has always been about how can we put regimes in place that subjugate the people and allow us to get those resources out, that oil out, on terms we like. In Iran in 1953, there was a democratically elected leader who kind of stepped on the toes of that whole system and tried to give a bit of a nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which later became BP, and he was taken out in a CIA MI6 coup. But if you look at the Gulf regimes, they've been controlled for centuries, or a century in the case of Saudi Arabia, but most of the other ones go back further and installed tyrants, mostly by the British government, to do that. And I think that when the Balfour Declaration came out in 1917, there was a couple of things. Firstly, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the UK, and I think it was and around Europe, and they saw this as a way to get rid of their Jewish population and move them somewhere where they could all go that would be outside of the borders of the European countries. But also, it was a way of ensuring that region stayed backwards and stayed basically under Western control, and that was explicitly spelled out by the former. He was the governor of Jerusalem for a period under the Mandate period, and he was asked by someone. They said, "Why did the British support Zionism?" This was before the state of Israel had been created, and he said, "We want to create a little Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism." So they knew that their control over the Arab world was weak. In terms of it could change at any point, and there were all the nationalist forces I talked about, which took power after the Second World War. They knew they were all running in the Middle East as well, and they thought, well, we can have a little satellite out there that can beat up the region for us and keep it under control and keep it backward. And I think that was the case up till quite recently. I mean, even in 1967, that's really a turning point when, because Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, was kind of the bête noire of the Western forces. And in fact, MI6 even had a plot to assassinate Nasser because he nationalized the Suez Canal. He was an Arab nationalist. He wanted to create an Arab nation. And obviously the Western powers wanted to keep the Arab world broken up and separated, and in the true colonial fashion, and in 1967, Israel defeated Nasser, and I think they saw that was a really important way that they could smash Arab nationalism and keep the region subjugated. I have to say, I feel like that's, as you say, evolved since then, and actually has now the major reason why we have such loyal support.
Radical Islam now. I mean, I think Israel has done more to promote this idea of radical Islam, and Israel is the main check against that.
Exactly.
It's constantly recreating justifications for why it's indispensable to the West, and that's one of the latest one.
Yeah, and it's important to talk about how Zionism relies on and promotes Islamophobia because it's central to its project, because it legitimizes the Zionist project, doesn't it? If you say constantly we are, these are the barbarians at the gates and we're on the front line, and they always say that explicitly. Netanyahu always says that they'll start with us, but they really want to get the Americans because they want to scare the American establishment and the American people into thinking that if they don't support Israel, then they're going to get attacked. But I actually think there's also another factor, which is that the Israel lobby has become so powerful that it's very, very difficult to have leaders rise up in the United States, the UK, and a lot of places in Europe that would maybe change policy on Israel. Because in 1982, Margaret Thatcher put an arms embargo on Israel after the invasion of Lebanon. And she wasn't someone who's the same politics as us, but she did that because, and that's unthinkable now. I think that, and obviously the same imperial dynamics were at play in 1982 as there are now. They the same control, but that she could do that because I think that the changing factor in that is that the Israel lobby's power has grown massively, and it's impossible for firstly leaders to rise up who might who have a pro-Palestinian position. We saw that very clearly with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. But secondly, our whole political class or large sections of it have been cultivated by the Israel lobby. Like it's explicit here with Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel. They take these politicians early in their career to Israel and the West Bank and take them on propaganda tours and effectively cultivate them into the Israeli way of thinking. And then later down the line, you have a situation where I don't think there's one anti-Zionist in the whole of Parliament, including the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I don't think there's one. There's people that are critical, like including Corbyn and John McDonnell and others, but they've never called themselves anti-Zionist. And we're talking about an ideology which is explicitly a colonialist, supremacist ideology. So it's kind of amazing that the discourse is so controlled that we haven't even got one lawmaker in the whole of Britain. And I think that's the major factor. And also the work we did at Declassified, because one of the things we've done from the start of Declassified is cover the Israel lobby. No media does it because they're scared of being accused of being anti-Semitic and in some cases scared of flack from the Israeli state itself. But all that work has shown me.
When you put it that way, the gap between Thatcher and Corbyn and the things that's happened in that period is quite amazing in the sense that authoritarian systems of domination, authoritarianism, they're constantly learning, they're constantly evolving, and almost like an organic being. And where they were during the time of Thatcher, I think they've learned that there are better ways, more sophisticated ways of imposing themselves on democratic systems, and that seems to be one of the results of that they've learned and they've evolved, same as Arab regimes have learned and evolved to, cement themselves. And I think similarly, I think the Zionist lobby has also learned from the period of Thatcher, period of Reagan. Even Reagan was very critical on Israel. So when you look at the 80s and where we are now, it's that there isn't really any space for our politicians to take a different position on anything to do with Israel.
Exactly, and that's why I believe that Israel lobby is the overriding factor. To go bluntly to the point that you asked about why do we give such, that is why I think it is, because you've seen a change in the political discourse and the political system. It has been infiltrated very successfully by Israeli interests, and they do it through, I mean, people don't like to talk about it, but they do it through explicitly Israel lobby groups like London Labour Friends of Israel and Conservative Friends of Israel. But there's also many groups which present themselves as fighting anti-Semitism and present themselves as Jewish communal groups, which are things we should all support. I mean, we all support the fight against anti-Semitism and the representatives for the Jewish community having positions in our society. But they've been infiltrated as well by, a lot of them have been infiltrated by the Israeli state as well. And it makes it much harder for people to see the Israel lobby. A very good example is the Board of Deputies of British Jews, right? Which presents itself as a communal group, but is explicitly an Israel, well, not explicitly, but implicitly. And if you look into it, they go for meetings with the UK government to promote Israeli interests. So they're an Israel lobby group. But there's a whole panorama, there's a whole ecosystem, and there's and that's it's a disaster for the Jewish community as well, because Zionism is not the same as Judaism. You know, this is a 4,000-year-old religion. Zionism was basically founded right at the end of the 19th century, not that long ago, about 125 years ago, and they're not the same thing. And and it's an ethno-nationalist ideology which has kind of corrupted and used Judaism to push its its goal, which is the creation of Israel and maybe greater Israel we're seeing now. But even the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, he was an atheist, a Hungarian atheist. He wasn't even a believer. So it's not that.
If I can quote Christopher Hitchens, I mean, there's a lot about his politics we'll disagree with, but on Zionism, and he made a comment once where he said that Zionism is a real waste of Judaism.
Yeah.
And I think it's so true. It's a waste of Judaism. Judaism is a historical tradition which made huge contributions to civilization, and then Zionism has kind of, undermined that tradition in many ways.
Yes, and has made, unfortunately, has made a lot of the Jewish community quite reactionary. And of course, the Jewish community throughout history was majorly involved in progressive movements, in theory, in philosophy, humanism, to do with like Karl Marx himself was Jewish, you know. But now it's it's become hitched, or large parts of the community have become hitched to this ethno-nationalist ideology, which is a maximalist ideology as well. It doesn't have any, you can't negotiate with it. If you see, like, it's just a war on anything Palestinian. Like that one of the most disgusting examples of that in recent years was when UK Lawyers for Israel complained about some paintings by some kids in Gaza that were up on a wall in Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. And said that they were making Jewish patients feel uncomfortable, and they got the paintings by kids removed, and they put a blog post up celebrating it. It said, which they got in trouble for because it was so blatant. But that's the thing: if you're so deeply inside that maximalist ideology, you can't see that other people might think it's a bit weird when you put up a blog post saying we're celebrating the fact that they've taken down some kids' paintings in a hospital. Disgusting stuff. And it is a tragedy. I mean, for me, it's like it's a continuation of the Jewish tragedy, unfortunately, because it's been hijacked. The other thing is it's also often anti-Semitic, because they one of the major weak points, the Achilles heel of the Zionist project, and Zionism is Jewish people that are anti-Zionist, and there's a lot of them and a growing number of them. And so there has to be mechanisms for kind of silencing them and smearing them as well. So you have these terms like self-hating Jew, and even people being called Jewish people being called anti-Semitic. We've seen it over and over again. So I do think that we're at a turning point on all this, though, because even before the Gaza genocide, you couldn't even really talk about Zionism as a political ideology. There was so much trepidation for speaking stridently on it, and speaking it in a way that we would about other settler colonial ideologies. But I think that is kind of all gone now, and you can say things now, and you can talk about it in a way. And the smears of anti-Semitism and all that, they don't work in the same way now. People are aware of what's been happening, and that this is very recent because.
So before we go into the cracks that are appearing in the Zionist narrative that's shielded Israel from criticism all these decades, I just wanted to just focus, because we will have a section on that. It's just I wanted to ask you, because you've done a lot of work through Declassified, exposing Britain's role in supporting the genocide in Gaza. So I wanted to just quickly ask, I mean, do you think Israel would be able to execute its genocide in Gaza without the support of course, the US, but also the UK? Many people don't realize, because you guys have exposed the number of reconnaissance flights that's been flown over Gaza. So just speak about that. I mean, do you think really, I mean, without the support of the US and the UK, that the genocide in Gaza could have been executed?
No, I mean, principally, it's the United States support that is the overriding factor. I think that if the US withdrew support and did an arms embargo, they'd run out of bombs pretty quickly. You know, they relied totally on they're a colony, and their military relies basically in whole on US. Also, 30% of Israeli weapons come from Germany as well, so they're involved. But what the work we've done has shown is that it's a tripartite genocide, in the sense that like US provides most of the arms, but the UK's role is an intelligence and logistics role, and it's not been covered at all in the press at all, which is an outrage and makes the journalists that are ignoring it complicit. But for example, we're flying still post the ICC arrest warrants being issued for Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. We're still flying a spy flight every day over Gaza from our base on Cyprus, which is in the air for 6 hours collecting intelligence, which is then handed to the Israelis. In the New York Times, there was a leak in the summer which showed that a British spy team was deployed inside Israel early in the genocide to help the Israelis with their operation in Gaza. And this Israeli official that leaked it in the New York Times, he said, the British spies give us, quote, value added, and they give us intelligence, quote, that we couldn't get by ourselves. So that's goes directly to your question about could they do it? Well, the Israelis are saying they couldn't do it without these British spies. So there you go. But that also there's also a logistics role, because a lot of the work we've been doing is about the role of this base on Cyprus, which we've had since independence, or so-called independence, in 1960. We retained 3% of Cyprus and turned it into the western part of it, massive airbase, and the eastern part of it, a massive intelligence station. And both those assets have been utilized for getting the genocide in Gaza done. And in the case of RAF Akrotiri, which is the airbase, there's been constant flights, military transport flights, going from there to Israel, especially in the early part of the genocide. And the UK government has not given an accounting, or one that's believable, about what was on those flights. You're talking dozens of flights daily at the start of the genocide, which they said were just carrying medical supplies. It doesn't make sense. One other important facet of it is the special forces role. And this is the point about this whole British and, to a degree, American role, is that it's all been done in secret, because obviously the spy team was leaked. The spy flights we know about because we're flight tracker websites, but that's not been divulged by the government, the number of them or where they're going from or anything. They did say they were going to start spy flights in December. And then the special forces role we know nothing about, but so it's all secret. The special forces role, the SAS were deployed to that Cyprus base in October, soon after the genocide started, and it was leaked to the Sun that they had deployed to that Cyprus base. And then the following day, the UK military issued what's called a D notice to tell all media editors they can't write anything more about what the SAS are doing in Gaza. And we've not had a single word since that the notice was issued about what the British special forces have been doing. And American special forces have also been deployed to Israel. Both of them might have been on the ground in Gaza. We don't know. So what is astounding to me is that there's not more interest in this secret war that the British are fighting within the media, because, and maybe it is because of the D notice, but again, officially the D notice is voluntary. So it's an outrage if journalists have access to information about the role that we're playing, and they're keeping it secret because of this D notice when they don't have to. They're not going to go to prison. But what I think is that we're basically just still scratching the surface, and that what I've just told you shows we're not complicit. We're participating. We are participating. If you're under international law, if you're providing intelligence and have personnel, military personnel there, I'm talking about the SAS, advising on the operation, or even potentially being on the ground in Gaza, you're obviously a participant. So how can the media be ignoring this when you have an investigation at the World Court, the highest court in the world, for genocide, and arrest warrants out for the Prime Minister and former Defense Minister of the country carrying out the genocide? I think there's a massive cover-up going on, but I think that part of the reason is because ministers in the Keir Starmer government, but also ministers from the previous Tory government, know that they could be legally, criminally liable for the participation that the British have done over the past year. I'll just say this as well, that there obviously was a suspension of 30 arms licenses of Britain, and that came from pressure about arms from activists and in some cases the media as well. But there's a misunderstanding that that's the main British part. It's not actually. Like as I say, the breakdown of arms to Israel is like 60% US, 30% Germany, and then all the rest of the countries 10%, maybe like 5% is Italy actually. So Britain's not a major player on that. But what we lead on, and this is uncontroversial now, based on the work we've done, is intelligence and logistical support. We lead on it. And that based on Cyprus, Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, said early on that RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus have become the international hub for getting equipment, weapons, spies, special forces to Israel for the genocide. So we are participants, and I think that there should be investigations by the ICC and other legal institutions of British ministers for this. And what is amazing is we were basically, not to blow our own trumpet, but we wouldn't know any of this without declassified. How is it that a website which has 2 full-time reporters, that's it, and now 1, is the only way we know about this? This is like one of the worst crimes of this era or any era, and we're revealing the participation of the British government. And we're like, how have the media dropped the ball?
And what you're describing is exactly why trust in the media has completely evaporated. And they're doing this to their own peril. I mean, I read a piece just recently in the New York Times. It's a really shocking article. Surviving Gaza. I don't know if you've seen the headline. Surviving Gaza with a boy with no hands. I mean, so what does that mean? It's surviving Israel. It's not surviving Gaza. Surviving Israel. But the way they cover up for Israel, it's really to their own detriment. And we've seen how trust has completely evaporated from the mainstream. And like you mentioned, Declassified has done an amazing job in exposing many of the war crimes. But we want to speak about the media. But I want to put that in a different context. I mean, the right, for example, people like Elon Musk and others will say the reason why there's so much distrust in the media is because the media has just gone woke, and they will give their own reasons why that's the case. But I mean, maybe you agree with me, but I think Gaza has done more to completely undermine the mainstream media than anything which the right claim, people like Musk and others say, is the reason why the mainstream media cannot be trusted. Every single day you'll see tweets from Musk saying, oh, the mainstream media has gone woke, can't be trusted, X is the only thing that you can trust. But I don't think that's the reason. The main reason is there's a huge disparity between what we see from Declassified and other alternative news sources, and the gap between that and what the mainstream is covering when it comes to Gaza. That's the main reason why there's a complete evaporation of trust in our mainstream.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, the interesting thing is that the right-wing critique of the mainstream media, as you say, is very surface level, and it is basically all based on culture wars issues. And I think that's that's a function of the system itself, because although they talk about, oh, we're against the deep state, it's all rubbish, because essentially they fall into line on all the central factors of that. But what they argue about, which is again in the interest of the deep state, ironically, is about these culture wars issues. And they go on, and some of it's correct, yes, you can't, and they are right about channels like CNN and MSNBC. They are. I used to live in the States, and they are actually impossible to watch. You feel like you're getting dumber as you watch them, you know. And in some ways, interestingly, I could watch Fox News rather than those two, because those two were just congealed establishment propaganda, effectively. And Fox News obviously is horrific right-wing content, but they did have a more sort of divergent views, and you'd see some criticisms of like the establishment discourse, often from the right, of course, which I didn't agree with, but there was a more vibrant debate you could see on it. It was more watchable. But I agree with you that but I think there's a reason that they only focus on that stuff, because it still protects the national security state, and it still protects all the deep elements of our state that don't want to be exposed and what they're getting up to. Because you don't see any of these people that moan about media bias from the right talking about the UK role in a genocide. Why not? And the media, the fact that they ignore it, and in fact are operating under a D notice. They don't mention it. It's way off, and they never will. So, but I think that the genocide in Gaza has changed everything in terms of the media. Even just talking to people that aren't even that political, people have.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, people have been exposed to this stuff online on social media, and cross-referenced it with the legacy media that they've been told tells the truth. Even institutions like the Guardian and the BBC that are held up as sort of liberal bastions, and they're seeing that they're getting completely distorted coverage. I don't think that juxtaposition, that contradiction, has ever been clearer, ever, because the severity of what Israel is doing, there's no two ways about it. You know, they're targeting civilians. There's more child amputees in Gaza than in the whole of modern history warfare. It's clear that this is a genocide, and it's clear that it's targeted at children and elderly and women. They're annihilating Gaza, and yet you have a media which is not reflecting that. Even Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Iraq was a terrible crime, but there wasn't the same exposure of what was happening on the ground that we could contradict with what the media is. So this is the first real conflict which has been backed by the West, where we've had access to information in real time, and that has revolutionized, I think, people's perception of the mainstream media. And I don't think it's going to go back. People will not stop at Gaza. They'll not look at Gaza and say, well, I've been lied to about Gaza. I'm going to go back to reading the Guardian now. They're going to say, well, the Guardian's probably lying to me about a whole host of things, and yes, they are. So hopefully and I think that's a healthy thing. The other thing is the mainstream media hate social media, don't they? They're always criticizing social media platforms as like purveyors of disinformation and stuff, which makes me laugh, because they are the major purveyors of disinformation in our society. They're the people that sold us the lies of the war in Iraq. And yet we're meant to go towards them and say, oh, yeah, well, thanks for telling us we shouldn't read independent journalists on Twitter because they're lying to us. No way. We don't. You have no leg to stand on that point.
We're going to end on this. I've been reading and listening to a lot of analysts on just describing the moment we're in currently following the Gaza genocide. So they will say things like, where before all the institutions of stability were quite strong, which meant that our future was quite narrow, But now they say our future is where before it was quite like this, quite predictable where we were heading, but now it's very unpredictable. We don't know. There's so many variations to where we could be heading in the next decade or so. And this unpredictability is really a result of the fact that the institutions which people had faith in, that were stable, they've lost trust in all those institutions. The right will point that out as well for their own reasons. But I think for people like you, me, and others, how important is this moment, given nearly all analysts will say we are in a period of extreme instability, but that comes with a positive side, which is that we are in control of which direction we take, in the future. There is more possibilities now than ever before because of the lack of faith and trust in the media and the institutions. So just to kind of end on this note, how important is this moment? People will say this is a turning point. How do you see this turning point? And what is the role of people like you, investigative journalists, and others who are working in this space?
Well, I think it's a turning point in world history, because I don't think the system has ever been this exposed. And all the different elements we talked about, Zionism, Israel, the US empire, the British role within the US empire, the media itself, they've all had to expose themselves more than I've ever seen in my lifetime. And the system is crumbling, because once the thing that protects the whole system is the information war, controlling the minds of the population, and making sure they believe all the myths which justify the system that they uphold. And they're all crumbling to pieces. In the rubble of Gaza, all that stuff is falling down, which is why for me it's quite interesting why the governments in Washington and London have supported this so loyally, because I think even on their own terms, it's not been good for them. Because, as I say, if they'd come out earlier and at least put a few checks on Israel, or at least said what's going on is awful war crimes, which was clear early on, they haven't done any of that. I think partly that's explained by the power of the Israel lobby, but essentially they've had to smash the whole system that was created after the Second World War to get this done. That includes like the ICC, for example. The ICC was set up, let's be honest, to try to put war criminals who are official enemies on trial, and up till now, that's what they've done. Yugoslav, Rwanda, whatever it is. Now they went so hard that they've had to issue arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, which is a massive psychological barrier breached and won't go back. They should have issued arrest warrants for Bush and Blair over Iraq as well. But all these things are going to be much more pushed for and possible, and in human consciousness now. All the ideas that were deeply ingrained are being challenged, and I think it's a very good thing. On the ground, though, I think that it's really unstable, because any kind of red lines have been crossed, and kind of when that happens, it's very, very hard to go back to how it was before, unless you have a massive conflagration like the Second World War, and then you create a new global order after that. But I think that we're heading towards a massive regional war, which is already happening, obviously. But I'm talking about, like, if you look at the rhetoric of Netanyahu, and obviously you've got Trump coming into the White House, they talk about Iran every time. Whenever they mention anything, he said Iran is the head of the octopus. They're not doing that for as a coincidence. They know that the end game for them is to take out the Iranian regime, and they won't be, and that's not going to be easy for them. And it's going to hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. And I don't think, and the other thing that people don't talk about enough, but is basically in the calculations of everyone's thoughts in the Middle East, is Israel has nukes. And if they're threatened existentially, they will set them off. They have no red lines. We've seen that. There's no way that you can trust that the Israelis will not set a nuke off at some point. So I think that we're heading down a dark, dark path, and I think that there's too many tensions in the Middle East for it to be resolved without a major conflagration, which is probably going to happen. But so I'm not optimistic about. I think there's two sides to it. There's what you've described, and me as well, about like the blinkers coming off for many people about how the world works and in whose interests, and the myth making of the Western powers about their own power. That's all happening. But the reality, the cost has been way too high on the ground in Gaza for those blinkers to come off. You're talking about a couple of 100,000 people probably killed, tens of thousands of kids killed, tens of thousands of kids mutilated. Lebanon now being destroyed. Well, Beirut, they were bombing it relentlessly yesterday. So the cost has been too high, and we don't know where it's going to end, because Israel's a rogue regime. It does not enforce any kind of adherence to international law, and I don't think they're going to stop until they have done everything they want to do and have been planning for many, many years. Because I'll finish with this: when Netanyahu made a speech, I think it was either on October 7th or October 8th, he said, "Stay with us. We're going to remake the Middle East." And they see this as their 9/11. Everything they've wanted to do for many years that they haven't been able to do, but for various political reasons, they now have this what they see as a justification to do it, and they're going to do it. This is why they went so hard in Gaza. This is why I don't think they'll rest until they've obliterated Lebanon. This is why I don't think they'll rest until they take out Iran as well. So it's not looking good. But obviously there is resistance, so they can't do everything they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, the scenario painted it is pessimistic, but I mean, at the end of the day, we know Israel's security, long-term security, at the end of the day, relied on it being able to convince the region that it can live in peace with its neighbors. And part of the reason for the so-called Abraham Accords was really a push towards that and demonstrating that Israel is at peace with its Arab countries. But after the genocide now, I think the region and its population, 350 million, are more convinced than ever that Israel in its current form does not want to live in peace. How can you live in peace with a country that's carried out a genocide and done what it's done? So even if the regimes want to do what they want to do, but I think the public will not allow for that. I hope that's the case. How can you have that scenario? That's what I
Well,
think.
it's a
So,
point. I think that's another element of this that I don't know enough actually to know what the situation is within like the Gulf states, for example, or Jordan or Egypt. But as you say, you would imagine that the Arab populations are like looking at what's going on in Gaza and looking at their regimes who are we're not supporting it, but basically haven't spoken out stridently at all. Jordan was shot down Iranian missiles and stuff, and they're sort of like, wow, maybe they're having that realization that we're having about our governments. I hope they are. So I hope that it will at some stage lead to some uprisings or some dissidents against the Gulf regimes, because they're effectively working for the empire and have been since dot. So we'll see what happens.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's been really delightful having you in MEMO Conversation. Really appreciate the work, the amazing work that you do. Thank you, and also thank our viewers for tuning in. This MEMO Conversation with me, Naseem Ahmed, and my guest, Matt Kennard. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.